about political ethnography as a research method and where it takes us. I guess I would like to start with a basic kind of at a definitional level, what I mean by political ethnography or ethnography, and first to start up with what it is, why one might want to do it, and how one goes about it. Just there's a chat message. Okay. Ethnography literally means writing culture. It has a complicated history over the last 100 years, and I don't want to get into it, but unless you really want to ask about this, but it is a kind of non-fiction writing which is immersive. It is immersed in a particular context. It could be a culture or it could be some other kind of context from within which you are producing a distinctive non-fiction genre of writing. There is some claim that immersion helps you understand some aspect of social political reality, and hence it is non-fiction, as opposed to someone being deeply immersed in a particular context and writing a novel or a short story based on it. It has been traditionally associated with the methods called participant observation, or where the person who is observing or gathering data and eventually analyzing it is also a participant in the field sites in which she or he is actually actively involved. And so the idea is that by being a participant in the locations that you are working in situ, you are generating in-depth data, and you are looking at not just snapshot pictures of what happens on one day or even a month or a year. You are looking at socio-cultural processes as they work through the everyday lives of ordinary people. Traditionally, again, ethnography has been associated with the discipline of anthropology within the social sciences, but it is not strictly true because it's also the case that ethnography has been used by sociologists, political scientists, perhaps even now historians and others in different disciplines. The anthropology as a discipline, of course, has its own issues, some complexities perhaps, with ethnography as a method. And this is most so since the 1980s with a kind of more post-structuralist kind of turn or literary turn in, at least in American academia. But one thing one could say about ethnography beyond disciplinary kinds of issues is that it is committed to what Clifford Geertz, the American cultural anthropologist, called thick description. There's a certain kind of notion of thickness or depth, which comes from being immersed in a particular context. There is also a focus of what Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, referred to as a practice anthropology or a practice sociology, where everyday micro practices are ultimately what your field notes are recording as data. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this is done as a kind of actual practice. And the third characteristic I would say about ethnography, regardless of discipline, is the relationship between the observers and the observed. And that there is a gap, there is a power relation, there might even be a hierarchy, you could say. And this is something that ethnographers are deeply aware of. And there are multiple sources of power relations that, that involve any kind of social science research, but there are specific elements that one must consider in ethnographic research, especially because you're so close and you're literally living with the research subjects that you study. There are also, of course, ethical questions, which I'll talk about at the end. Political ethnography, for me, is something that involves studying power ethnographically. And these power relations, power dynamics, are being studied not from the point of view of state actors or the UN or any of the kinds of actors that you see in a political science or IR kind of program. There is a commitment for political ethnographers to study power from below, which is to say from the eyes and from the life worlds of ordinary women and men. The idea really here now is that it is political in the sense that the object of study is politics or what in society. And at the same time, it is political because by studying certain kinds of phenomena from below, you are making, there is a certain kind of political aspect which is different from the politics of a discipline such as IR, international relations, where you understand society in some ways from the point of view of states or international actors. And that is really the view from above. So in that sense, the view from below is something that the ethnographer is committed to, and hence this is an important element in what increasingly is now called political ethnography. Okay. There are three broad approaches that I want to kind of sketch out, not because I am a partisan of any of these, but I want to just put it out there so that you understand that there are different ways of doing ethnography, especially political ethnography. The first one is the most familiar. It's the dominant paradigm in the social sciences. It is positivist. This is the idea that the mind is a mirror of nature that is out there. And all observations, all observed data are essentially some way of uncovering the truths that are latent in society or in nature as a whole. So the ethnographer here, whatever you see, and really this is your data and you put it down in a notebook or in some kind of other way of recording, audio-visual or audiovisual, and ultimately whatever form you record the data, whatever it is, you ultimately see this as somehow a snapshot of reality around you. So that's one approach. The other approach, which is competing and is associated in, at least in American anthropology, this has been the dominant approach, is interpretivist. The idea here is that the ethnographer does record field notes, but these field notes are, and the data that is recorded in different forms, they are like a puzzle which must be solved. And so the purpose of interpreting what you find is to think about society as a kind of text, very much like a literary text or a cinematic kind of script, where you're basically trying to unravel many layers of meaning in which there are characters, there are plots, there are storylines, and there are processes that you are trying to reconstruct through the very day-to-day banal practices that you're recording, or whatever. It could be a festival, it could be a ritual, it could be an election. These are things that happen in the life of the community that you're in. And ultimately it is your job to interpret what all of this means. And you have to write it up in a way that makes it intelligible to your scholarly audience or a wider audience beyond the community that you are embedded in. The last approach, which is postmodern or postmodernist, ultimately blurs the distinction between the fiction and the non-fiction that I talked about earlier. And ultimately it is entirely, and that is because the perspective of the ethnographer is seen to be dominant. His or her biases, his or her blind spots, these are ultimately believed to be the guiding dominant force in the generation of data. In fact, perhaps the term data or any kind of notion of evidence might well be disavowed by the postmodernist, because ultimately this data would be seen to be entirely a function of the researcher and the way in which the research object is constructed. Now, all of these three, I don't want to get into a great deal of detail, and I'm happy to answer more questions, but these are three ways in which ethnography is done today, for better or for worse. The question I pose at the end of the slide is I have no strong commitments to either of them. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. But the challenge always is, how can we learn from the strengths of each of these three approaches and at the same time minimize their very obvious weaknesses? And this is really the challenge that any ethnographer faces in the field. And of course, this is determined by the kind of field sites you have, the kind of topic you're researching, who you are. All of these things do matter in kind of figuring out what kinds of data that you generate, how you analyze and interpret them, and ultimately how you write them up and reach an audience in one discipline, many disciplines, or perhaps even outside of academia. Okay, I'm going to start with, I have 3 case studies, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is related to my own doctoral research. This relates to a basic correlation that many, many researchers found about 15 years ago, around the time when Manmohan Singh said that Naxalites are the top internal security threat in India. The incidence of Maoist violence or Maoist activity, broadly speaking, recruitment even, appeared to be very highly correlated in statistical terms with these variables: poverty, the kind of geography, forest, hilly terrain, the existence of minerals under the earth's surface, scheduled tribe populations or Adivasi populations. And people tried to show at a disaggregated level of the state or the district or even block, sub-district, it was possible to show these correlations in a statistical sense. Now, the question that arose for many of us at that time, this is about 10, 12 years ago, the question was that whether correlation implies causation, which is a classic question that quantitative researchers ask in the social sciences. Now, what in my doctoral research I showed, because my work was partly historical about Jharkhand, and it was also ethnographic. And I'll explain a little bit about how I went about my research. But one of the things I'll say here is that I found that this correlation was really caused by Maoist groups being pushed into certain areas, certain states, or certain parts of states, not by choice, but simply by the actions of counterinsurgency forces or by the defeats they may have suffered in the electoral system in states like Bihar or Andhra Pradesh. This is why they had ended up in Jharkhand or parts of Chhattisgarh, in Bastar, or in parts of Maharashtra and Orissa. And one of the things which I noticed as I moved, not only in Jharkhand, but also in Bastar and elsewhere, is that there was no neat ideological way in which this particular kind of left politics was able to understand the context that they were in, the social structures, the cultural dynamics. And while they tried, certainly tried, but there was fundamentally what I focused on were the many slippages by which how Maoists understood Adivasi society or how they understood caste, and how Adivasis and Dalits, young, old, men and women, how they came to see the party vis-a-vis NGOs, the government institutions, and so on that were there in that particular district or block. And even when young Adivasi men and women joined or supported the party for various reasons, mostly private reasons, sometimes right down to family reasons, invariably the party was a kind of revolving door by which many of them ended up in rival groups or factions. And in a district in Jharkhand, typically at the height of the Maoist movement about 10 years ago, a district may well have had 30 to 40 splinter groups. So there was a deep fragmentation. Much of it was caused by personal rivalries and so on, but you have to understand the motivations from the bottom up, how and why these particular people in their life trajectories joined a violent movement on the left, and at the same time, how they, their families, their supporters in those villages continued to make claims on the state, say in the form of NREGA, and also worked with developmental or environmental NGOs in the area. So one of the things there are 2 issues which I want to point out that ethnography revealed here. One is that the Maoists, there was no obvious reason in explaining this correlation that statistics seem to reveal. And there was a way in which ethnography pointed to new answers that could be explored in, say, other places, in, say, Bastar or in Orissa. And this relates ultimately to the micro dynamics of youth politics at a kind of really micro level, at a block level, or even within a block in different villages, and to see how ultimately the same pattern was being worked out in different micro political contexts. There were private reasons, there were splintering and factionalization and fragmentation, and ultimately this stemmed from the kinds of motivations and the life trajectories of the youth who joined. And ultimately the people who came from outside these states or outside these districts ultimately, they had a very limited understanding of the bottom-up approach that the ethnographer was actually privy to. And what they certainly couldn't figure out is how the Maoists could coexist with both the state as well as NGO type actors. And this is really something that was a kind of ideological challenge as much as a practical one. But this was certainly not an ideological or practical challenge for normal villagers who had to navigate between multiple sovereignties, multiple forms of political authority that might even change from night and day in some of these places. So that's the multiple sovereignties aspect, the splintering and fragmentation, the divergence of perspective from top and bottom. These are perspectives that micro level data revealed, and it was whatever correlation may have existed in statistical terms, it really could be explained not by some kind of eclectic affinity or some kind of neat relationship between a rebel group and its kind of host society, so to speak. I wanted to say a little bit about the process by which I went about doing my fieldwork, because initially, of course, I come from the Bihar-Jharkhand area. I have family and friends in that area, but my preliminary fieldwork took place in central Jharkhand, just south of Ranchi, a couple of hours south there. And I made my initial contacts and did my initial work essentially through NGO contacts who were there. I worked as a development worker for a while. And ultimately, I was able to get to know in every NGO, whether in a city or a rural area, there will always be people who are local community representatives. And these are the people that I ultimately got to know very well. They taught me Mundari, and that was very, very critical as I learned like songs or the words as I kind of went through. It was quite clear that I was not primarily interested in acting as I was never a paid employee of the NGO, so I was just literally shadowing the NGO. And so I became much more invested in understanding the everyday rhythms of rural life, and learning the language was obviously a major activity. Mostly children who are actually very useful for helping me understand the nuances of the language. And for me, I guess, I would say that the preliminary fieldwork really helped me understand many of the things that the literature, academic literature, simply did not grasp because there was a certain bottom-up knowledge that was necessary even to figure out what is your research question and what is the best way to go about doing your research and the kind of the research design, so to speak. And so when I went back to the university to kind of write up a grant and to do my research, I was able to draw on my extensive kind of preliminary fieldwork, language training, kind of learning the context and getting to know people in particular villages where I would subsequently go back. And then obviously, if you know 5 people, you're going to know 50 people very soon in any Indian village. And so there was a kind of snowballing in terms of the sampling, the snowball sampling that people call that. And this obviously leads you to test out various hypotheses that you may initially establish. And so there is a way in which certain patterns will emerge as you get to 50 and 100 and several hundred people that you meet during the course of your research. So ultimately, the question of immersion or embedding in the field is really quite critical here. To access the field, therefore, at least in my case, I chose to go not through a government actor, but through a neutral non-state actor in a conflict zone. The NGO had ultimately encountered Maoists in the conflict zone, but they ultimately worked with the government, the local bloc, the local district officials. And so there was a certain kind of uneasy coexistence. And within that, once you get down to the village level, you realize that the nature in which political authority is shared, it's fragmented, it changes by day and night. And this is the life of the village continues. Children go to school, shops stay open sometimes, or sometimes they're forced to close in a month. And so you really understand the everyday workings of village life, especially when conflict is to be managed and violence in a conflict is minimized through various kinds of mechanisms. So this is something that I was particularly intrigued by. And because I was able to work not through the middle class NGO officials who were in a district town, for example, or in Ranchi, it was possible for me to be in the village and to make contacts, to basically do very kind of traditional village ethnography and to try to understand how people were living and how their interactions during this kind of conflict, which sometimes turned violent periodically, how this ultimately was able to structure their lives and how they were able to participate in various life projects of their own, sometimes by exploiting a situation which was quite distinctive. I kept regular field notes. I kept on a day-to-day basis. I sometimes used voice notes. Sometimes I used, I wrote notebook, or I had opportunities to actually write down things. And eventually, on a periodic monthly basis, or I was able to read and analyze and kind of develop further notes from what I had been accumulating. So there is an extensive process of recording that I certainly participated in, and which helped me in writing up my ethnography from the raw data that I had collected. And that for me was a critical kind of primary source. I don't necessarily think of it as some kind of objective truth that I was recording in those things. Obviously, there were the particular experiences that I had, particular contacts, particular contexts. And I do acknowledge all of this. Even then, I would say that, it is a sliver of reality that the ethnographer is able to get at without claiming to know all of it. In general, my view is that all the social sciences, in terms of all social science methods, are really what they can help you do is to try to get a fix on a particular sliver of reality and tell us and something interesting about it, rather than claim to know the overall big picture. And I think it's as we collect the slivers, a literature is able to kind of, I think, in a composite way, across methods, across disciplines, we are able to understand what is really going on. And I think that is a very complex process by which there is a kind of layering of different kinds of work. And so there is social science in that sense is a dialogue, it's a conversation, and it is very much a collaborative practice from where I'm coming from. The second case study that I'm going to talk about in much more briefly has to do with democracy, which is traditionally not something that ethnographers have studied. Typically, it has been left to people working with statistics or people working in a more normative mode about what democracy ought to be, whether it's the rule of the people or whether it is simply understood to be elections happening in a regular way and managed in some particular by a kind of umpire of some sort, like the Election Commission. Now, political scientists, especially in the United States, have seen India as an anomalous case of democracy. It's a very unlikely democracy. That's what American political scientists told us in the 50s and 60s. And the reason why it was unlikely is because it did not meet various social and economic preconditions, especially per capita income and so on. It was a very poor country, and the Americans believed that it was likely to go communist in the Cold War. And really, for them, a country like India was an anomaly. Democracy, they said, really should not have happened. Or even if it does happen, surely after Nehru's death, it is going to all disintegrate. But of course, in whatever form, people with various challenges, the democratic institutions have not, by and large, fallen apart entirely. Generally, political scientists, when they have studied Indian democracy, especially in the last generation, they have developed very sophisticated tools to look at survey and voting data, which point to waves and counter waves, reverse waves of democracy. They have looked at the changing alliances of voters, voting blocks in relation to different political parties. They have certainly been very good at looking at the shifting preferences of voters in very, very micro ways, and trying to kind of connect the micro and the macro levels of how we know about these things. But the contribution of ethnography out here leads us to what I started with in this case study, looking at the anomaly of Indian democracy. One of the things which we see from the work of Lucia Michelutti, for example, is how democracy or democratic institutions, including its ideals, have become vernacularized in states such as, her field sites in UP. And that is a different sort of contribution from what we know through survey and voting data in particular. Likewise, if you think about the importance of social hierarchy, sometimes this is seen in the way in which people go and touch the feet of important people, politicians, and at the same, and this sort of behavior, this kind of deep respect, this kind of way of hierarchizing relations between voters and those who represent them, seems very odd. And from a Western perspective, where there is a kind of formal equality, then people, in fact, the American presidential candidates typically, not this year, but typically try to all claim that they're middle class. And frankly, 80% of America claims to be middle class, which itself talks, is a kind of curious fact of political psychology. But that is the peculiarity of American democracy. What is the peculiarity of Indian democracy is that social hierarchy in its various forms, not just caste, but many forms, can coexist with the promise, at least, of equality, that one person has one vote, man and women, poor, rich or poor, and that, as Mukulika Banerjee points out, that there are rituals of elections which ultimately produce a certain kind of community, there is a certain kind of a sacral quality that she assigns to elections, and ultimately the way in which people participate in these electoral rituals is in the form of formal equality, even if there is deep inequality and in fact rank hierarchy in society at large. So the rituals really punctuate what is a kind of everyday structural reality that most people inhabit. These are insights which I think are very useful to point out about what is distinctive about Indian democracy, both in normative and empirical terms. And some of these ethnographic perspectives are complementary to what you obtain from other social science methods, especially quantitative methods. But of course, some of the claims that have been generated through ethnography, political ethnography from below, they really point to issues, and they put up data which really compel us to look afresh at what we always thought we knew. And this is what I think the main contribution of ethnography is, that it is able to make us think anew about things we thought we already understood. And certainly the other social science methods seem to ignore or to skim over. The last case study, which also relates to work I'm doing at this time, which relates to migration. I've looked at migration from Jharkhand and Eastern India broadly to cities like Delhi and Bombay. And now I'm looking at migration from different parts of South Asia to the Gulf states, and since I'm now in Qatar. And traditionally, migration is seen by economists, it's seen in a very economistic way as a kind of one-way, unidirectional kind of pattern. It moves from the villages, the rural, to the urban, to the cities, and what flows back are economic remittances. So there is this kind of flow and reverse flow, and it is fundamentally seen as economic in nature. Ethnographic work, on the other hand, tells us a lot about the non-economic motivations for human mobility. For instance, we have stories of people, of young people, seeing migration to a city as a rite of passage. We see certain kinds of work, for example, as ways to actually access a reality which is much wider than the rural context that, that migrants have grown up in. In certain cases, we understand the household, the changing household dynamics, gendered, for example, in certain cases, due to human mobility. And there is a way in which women or young men can exercise certain kinds of agency which really must be understood in a way that is quite different from simply a kind of cost-benefit analysis. In many cases, the cost-benefit analysis is adverse. Living in the city actually might make you worse off in economic terms, and yet people persist. So there are other motivations, and there are other kind of pull factors, so to speak, that one must look for. Likewise, the movement of people from the rural to the urban turns out in most ethnographic work on migration to be circular or at least non-linear. So the patterns of movement are people kind of moving around, or irregular patterns, especially since there can be rural migration, and there can be rural-urban migration too, takes various forms. You could move to the district town, you could move to the state capital, or you could move to a big city like Delhi or Mumbai, or perhaps even overseas, you could go to Dubai or Singapore. And so the patterns of circulation often take this non-linear form. And one of the most interesting areas where people, I think, are working today is how urban and rural spaces, as well as livelihoods in terms of skills and so on, how they are interconnected and how certain kinds of transfers might be emerging. And so what we see as two very starkly different worlds might be coming together in interesting ways. The rural is always in every urban space. And of course, the question arises whether the urban is also in every rural space from this perspective. As we follow one of the approaches that I have is that I follow people around as they circulate. And so the patterns of circulation allow the ethnographer to actually travel with the people that you are actually working with. One of the big questions for me that arises, and it's something that ethnographers in some form or the other have been asking, is whether the big cities, the big Asian megacities that we have in India or elsewhere, are these really being subsidized by our villages, where ultimately the households of the migrants reside? And whether they're engaged in agriculture or not, the fact remains that the homestead, the rural household still remains the bulwark of even the urban economy. Because even when people live in low-income neighborhoods or chawls or slums, the families, the homes of these migrants to big cities still happens to be in particular rural locations, which seem to be absorbing the costs, but also operates as the remittances even that come in, their fundamental kind of sociological purposes does not seem to be that of a family firm. There people are maybe, for example, sending out daughters to collect dowries, which ultimately will help them get married. So there are many different ways in which the household dynamics, the kinship dynamics of a rural household is important to understand as subsidizing the process of infrastructure development in cities or various kinds of services that are generated within urban spaces, which we kind of take for granted. And I would really, I'm going to end here, but I'm going to kind of urge people to think about the many different ways in which the rural and the urban kind of are intertwined across our lives. I'm going to end with one slide here, which talks about, you've heard all the nice things that ethnography does. I should be upfront and tell you about what are the limitations and frankly, the downsides of political ethnography. The first one is that the problem of generalization or validity, external validity, that how can you work in a village, a district, or even a state in different places, even if it's over a long period of time, and what kind of possibility is there to generalize from one or a few cases that we are looking at. This is obviously an issue. Obviously, if you're doing large and statistical work where your countries are the unit of analysis at a very macro level, this problem is much less likely. Question is of the trade-off between breadth and depth is also something to consider. This is something that ultimately every ethnographer has to consider. How much breadth would you like in terms of the coverage that you're achieving? Are you just going to have one village in your study? Are you going to just focus on one block or multiple kind of villages and other kind of blocks? Or are you going to really, so how do you concentrate the resources that you have in a short span of time? Most people are working for 1 year, if you're lucky, 2 years or 1.5 years. And you have to make the most of the time you have. I was very lucky that I spent in 2 or 3 installments, I spent over 3 years of fieldwork, and that is, I would say, quite unusual. I also had to go to archives, so it really, for me, was a way in which the different kinds of data I could triangulate, and to some extent, I was able to move around and try to work this trade-off in my favor in terms of trying to get some amount of depth and some amount of breadth together in my research. In terms of research ethics, I think there are a number of important limitations and points to think about. Ethnography can be a very unwelcome intrusion into the lives of people who are not doing social science, and they're not interested in social science. They're certainly not the consumers of social science. So there is a way in which you might well pose a disruption in the lives of other people. It's not, historically, it is not the case that people have looked at, you don't end up in the houses of the rich or even the middle class and kind of end up doing your participant observation research. So it seems that there is very much a tendency, not just in India, but elsewhere. Ethnography has always been a way of studying downwards, and the power relations that I talked about initially between the observer and the observed are critical to keep in mind. And at what point do we become unwelcome guests of those who are our research subjects is something to consider. There's also, of course, the issue of misrepresentation. We misrepresent the risk of misrepresenting our research subjects is very real. It is very important to understand what people are saying, to understand, of course, ideally the languages that are spoken in a particular place, and to represent them fairly and accurately in all their diversity, rather than try to use one person or 2 people as kind of caricatures or stereotypes of what might be going on. Even more grave issue is there are forms of intellectual or cultural appropriation that might take place through ethnographic research. And in that sense, there would be a kind of perversion of the method itself. And these are things that institutional review boards are, of course, mindful of, peer reviewers are mindful of. And there is a way in which, as a scholarly community, one has to be aware of all the downsides of ethnographic research. It is not a panacea for all ills. And lastly, and this again goes back to the postmodern tendencies of a lot of ethnography, especially in the United States, is whether the individual personalistic traits of researchers bears too heavily on the data generated, bears too heavily on the narrative that we read. And this is, to some extent, unavoidable. But can there be too much of navel gazing? Can there be too much about reflexivity? Of course, the problem of not being reflexive or not thinking about one's personal characteristics, how one accessed the field, how one generated data is also problematic. But can there be a case where the entire fieldwork is down to who you are and how you go about your own scholarly pursuits? So these are things to keep in mind. As I end here, I just want to point out that all the social science research methods have their limitations, and they're really quite bad. If you were to be critical, there is no end to criticize any particular social science research method. But the trick really for me is how we are able to understand what each method contributes and how to use these different skill sets, these different methodological tools to achieve the goals that we want to achieve in our research. And usually having a wide kind of toolkit is probably the best way. So methodological pluralism of some kind is probably the best way to go about doing your research, because who knows, maybe next time you'll need political ethnography, but so far you've been working mostly with regressions. And I feel that it's best to keep an open mind, to stay pluralistic, and